She was 22 years old, and everything she owned fit inside a flour sack, a change of clothes, a wool scarf that had belonged to her mother. $3.40 she had saved coin by coin over 2 years of washing dishes in the back of a hotel kitchen, and a glazier's knife, with a handle worn so smooth by her teacher's grip that it felt like touching an old handshake every time she picked it up. With those $3.40, she bought an abandoned gristmill on the edge of a county nobody in Ohio talked about anymore. The mill had not turned in 16 years. But what nobody knew, what she herself would not discover until her 3rd week there, when she finally worked up the courage to open the door to the millstone room, was that someone had left something behind, not by accident, and what she found there, wrapped in canvas and pressed between 2 flat stones, like a letter meant for a stranger, would change everything she thought she understood about herself, and the life still waiting for her. We want to tell you her story, because we think you've met someone like her before. Maybe you've been someone like her, and we think it's worth hearing all the way through. Her name was Cora Dunne, and she was born in the winter of 1872 in Millhaven, Ohio, a town that existed mostly as a name on county maps, and an argument between 2 rival churches over which one had the better pastor. Her father, Hugh Dunne, had been a glass worker at the Millhaven window factory until the factory closed, and after that, a man without particular direction who spent his days doing odd jobs and his evenings sitting on the back porch in a way that suggested he was waiting for something he had already decided would not come. Her mother, Agnes, died of fever when Cora was 9. Cora remembered her mostly as a series of sensations: the weight of her hand on a forehead, the smell of camphor and chamomile, the sound of her singing something low and wordless when she thought no one was listening. After Agnes died, the house grew quieter in a way that had nothing to do with noise. Hugh Dunne remarried 2 years later. The woman's name was Vera Fisk, and she had come to Millhaven from somewhere in Pennsylvania with a trunk full of linen and a set of opinions she applied to every surface she encountered. She was not cruel in ways that left visible evidence. She simply had a clear picture of what a household should look like, and Cora did not fit the picture. Vera had 2 sons of her own, both younger than Cora, and she managed the household the way a person manages a ledger. Everyone in their column, everything accounted for, nothing wasted on what did not produce a return. Cora cooked and cleaned and did the washing. She was expected to be useful in ways that did not require being noticed. She was not invited to eat at the table when Vera's sisters visited. She was not asked what she wanted to study when the boys were enrolled in the county school, though she had taught herself to read from her mother's Bible before she was 8. She understood early that the rules of the house had been written without her in mind, and that the only sensible response was to become very good at the things she was allowed to do, and to keep everything she actually was in a place where Vera could not reach it. The person who reached her instead was a woman named Ruth Pell, who lived alone above her own glazing shop on the east end of Millhaven's Main Street, and who had been, in the 30 years since her husband left, a glazier, an occasional letter writer for people who could not read, a keeper of a small library of books she lent out on the honor system, and the only person in the county who could cut a curved pane of glass without cracking it. Cora first went to Ruth Pell's shop at age 11, not looking for work or instruction, but because she had broken a window pane in the kitchen while sweeping and was desperately trying to find someone who would replace it before Vera came home. Ruth Pell looked at the measurements Cora had scratched onto a piece of paper, cut the glass in 4 minutes, charged her 15 cents, and then said, "You measured it yourself?" Cora said she had. Ruth said, "Come back Saturday. Bring your apron." She went back Saturday. She went back the Saturday after that. For 7 years, she went back every Saturday and most Wednesdays, and Ruth Pell taught her everything: how to score a line with a single unbroken stroke and let the glass find the cut, how to mix putty to the right consistency, not too stiff or it would crack in the cold, not too soft or it would never set, how to identify the wavy distortion of old crown glass versus the flat clarity of cylinder glass, how to glaze a church window and a greenhouse and a clock face and a cabinet door, how to read the grain of a piece of glass the way a farmer reads soil, looking for what it would do under pressure, how it wanted to break, where its strengths were hidden. Ruth worked in silence mostly, which Cora came to understand was not unfriendliness but respect. She did not explain what she was doing while she was doing it. She let Cora watch, and then she let Cora try, and when Cora made mistakes, she did not correct them with words but with demonstration, picking up the tool and showing the motion again, patient and precise and unhurried. On the morning of Cora's 18th birthday, Ruth Pell gave her the glazier's knife. It was a professional's tool, English-made, with a brass wheel cutter set into a steel shaft and a hickory handle that had been shaped by years of use into something that fit a hand like a cast. Ruth said only that it had been her teacher's before it was hers, and that it was old enough that the wood knew what it was for. Cora wrapped it in a piece of chamois leather and carried it with her from that day forward. She did not know yet that she would carry it out of Millhaven in a flour sack 17 months later. Ruth Pell died in the autumn of 1891. She went quietly, the way capable people sometimes do, as though dying were simply another task they had decided to get done efficiently. She left the shop to a nephew in Columbus, who appeared once to inventory the contents, sold the equipment to a buyer from Cincinnati, and locked the door. There was no bequest for Cora. There had been no reason for Ruth to imagine that Vera Fisk's stepdaughter would need one. By the time Cora was 21, it was just her and her father and Vera in the house that smelled of Vera's cleaning vinegar and her father's pipe and the specific silence of a man who had stopped expecting anything good. Her brothers, Vera's sons, not hers, though she had raised them as much as anyone, were grown and living elsewhere. And there was nothing left in Millhaven that was hers except the glazier's knife in its chamois wrapping and the small coins she had saved from years of hotel work. The morning Vera asked her to leave was a Saturday in March of 1893. Cora had been late coming home the night before. She had stayed to help close the kitchen after a banquet, and the extra hour meant an extra quarter which she needed. Vera was awake when she came in. She did not shout. She spoke in the measured tone she reserved for decisions already made. She said that Cora was a grown woman and that it was time she made her own way. She said that Hugh agreed, though Hugh was not in the room and Cora would not be given the chance to hear it from him directly. She said there was money set aside for the situation. $5. Folded into an envelope on the kitchen table with Cora's name written on the front in Vera's precise accountant's hand. Cora stood in the kitchen for a moment. She looked at the envelope. She looked at the window above the sink, which she had reglazed herself 3 years ago when a hailstorm cracked the original pane, and which fit perfectly, sealed without a draft, the putty still clean and smooth along every edge. She picked up the envelope. She went to her room and packed the flour sack. She did not look for her father. She did not call his name. She went out the front door, and she walked to the end of Millhaven's Main Street, and she turned east, because the road went east, and because she had read, in one of Ruth Pell's borrowed books, that the farmland in Perry County was old and quiet, and had a way of absorbing people who had come to the end of something and did not yet know what came next. She walked for 2 days. The first night she slept in the loft of an unlocked hay barn outside a town called Thornwick, burrowed into loose straw, with the flour sack pressed against her chest. The second night she slept under the overhang of an old stone spring house off the road, and she lay awake listening to the water, moving over the rocks beneath the wooden lid, and watching the stars, and feeling something she did not have an exact word for. Not peace, not grief, but a kind of hollow readiness, as if something had been emptied out of her, and the space was waiting to be used for something new. On the second afternoon, she came into a crossroads settlement called Garnet Fork. It was not much: a general store, a livery, a Methodist church with a patched roof, and a yard full of geese that moved with the unhurried authority of creatures who considered themselves the prior residents. The store was run by a man named Orson Webb, who was 71, and had the unhurried patience of someone who had watched enough people come and go to know that most of what seemed urgent was not. Cora bought a pound of dried beans and a small sack of cornmeal with 60 cents from her $5, and asked if there was work in the area for someone who could cut and glaze glass, repair window sash, and set putty. Orson Webb looked at her hands. Glaziers have a particular kind of callus along the base of the index finger where the cutter presses, and across the pads of the palm where you grip the glass to score. He looked at those places with the eye of someone who understood physical work, and then he said, "There might be. Depends on how particular you are about where you sleep." She told him she was not particular. He leaned on the counter and said that there was an old mill property about 3 miles up the creek road, a grist mill, that had been sitting empty since the county took it over for unpaid taxes in 1877. The family that had owned it was gone west, gone to the city, gone in the ways that people went after the bad years of the 70s. The county had been trying to move it off the books for years. Last price he'd heard was $3, which was not a price for a working mill, he said. It was a price for the county to stop writing it down in the ledger. Cora set her remaining $4.40 on the counter and asked to see the county land agent. The land agent was a tired-looking man named Gus Mary, who smelled of pipe tobacco and had the expression of someone who had long ago made peace with the gap between how things ought to go and how they actually went. He wrote up the transfer on half a sheet of official paper. Cora signed her name. She paid $3. Exactly 3 of the $5 that Vera Fisk had enclosed in the envelope on the kitchen table as the sum total of what her presence in that household had been worth. And the Harwick Mill property was hers. The property was 11 acres of creek-bottom land with a 2-story mill building, a miller's cottage attached at the back, a smokehouse that had collapsed on one side, and a mill race that had been filling in with silt and debris for 16 years, but whose stone channel was still visible beneath the overgrowth. There was a mill pond above the race, small and still and brown, with tannins from the oak trees that had grown up around it in the years of neglect. The mill building itself was timber-framed, heavy oak posts and beams that had been notched and pegged together in the way of buildings meant to last. The siding was vertical plank, and a third of the planks on the north face had warped and split and let 16 winters of moisture into the frame, but the frame itself was sound. Cora walked through every room, pressing her palms to the posts and beams, feeling for soft spots, for the give that meant rot had reached the core. The oak was hard everywhere she pressed. Old-growth timber cut from trees that had been a century old when they were felled, and it would outlast anything planted in her lifetime. The windows were mostly intact, which surprised her, and then did not because the building was set back from the road and behind a screen of second-growth locust and cedar, and scavengers preferred easier targets. 3 panes were broken. 1 sash had rotted through and fallen, but the rest held, and even the broken panes had cracked rather than shattered, which meant the putty was still good, the frames still square. The millstones were in place, 2 pairs of them, the upper runners sitting in their cases, gray and cold and absolutely still. The wooden gear works above them, the great wooden wheel and its wallower, and the shaft that ran down to the water wheel outside, were dry and seized but intact. A miller would have known immediately whether the gears could be freed, and the stone set turning again. Cora was not a miller, but she knew solid construction when she put her hands on it, and she ran her fingers along the teeth of the wooden gears, tapping each one, listening for the sound of punky wood or hidden rot. She did not hear it. The millstone room was at the back of the building, separated from the main grinding floor by a plank door that had swelled shut with moisture and required her full shoulder to open. When it gave, the smell that came out was old grain and dust and stone. The smell of a room that had been sealed against the weather and had preserved itself in the darkness like something cured. There was a single window on the north wall, the pane intact, the light filtering through years of grime into a gray underwater dimness. She would not open the things she found there for 3 more weeks. She would not even let herself think too much about it. She was not yet a person who lived in that house. She was still the person who had just bought it, and there was a difference. She spent the first week clearing. She dragged broken lumber and fallen branches and 16 years' worth of leaf full from every room she could reach. She found an iron cook stove in the miller's cottage, still connected to a clay-lined flue that had not cracked. She built a fire in it the first evening, and the draw was perfect, and she sat beside it on the plank floor, with her beans cooking in a tin pot and the fire warming the stones around her. And she let herself feel, for the first time since her mother died, that she was in a room that belonged to her. She reglazed the 3 broken windows in the first 4 days. She had no new glass, but she found, in a cabinet in the millstone room, a cache of old window panes that someone had stored there years ago. Salvage glass from some earlier repair, each one wrapped in newspaper dated 1874. The glass was wavy and amber-tinted, the old kind, and when the afternoon light came through it, it threw small moving patterns on the wall that looked like water. She set each pane in putty she made from boiled linseed oil and chalk. She ground from a piece of limestone she found along the creek bed, and she worked the way Ruth Pell had taught her, slow and without force, letting the tool find the line. It was the sound that told her something was there. On the 22nd day, she was sweeping out the millstone room with a broom she'd made from bundled creek willow, and the broom head caught on a gap between 2 of the flat stones that lined the base of the millstone casing. The foundation course, the row of stones that bore the weight of the whole grinding assembly. She swept past it and then stopped and went back. She knelt and pressed her fingers into the gap. The stone shifted, not much, a fraction of an inch, and in the wrong direction, upward, not sideways, as if it had been set from above and seated on a void rather than packed into a course. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. She got the glazier's knife from her flour sack. The blade was not meant for masonry, but the tip was narrow and strong, and she worked it along the edge of the stone, clearing the debris that had packed into the joint over the years. Working carefully, the way Ruth had taught her to work. Not forcing, but finding the line of least resistance and following it. The joint opened in dry gray powder. When it was clean, she worked the knife's blade beneath the edge of the stone and levered it upward. It came free more easily than it should have, because it had been lifted before. Beneath the stone was a space. Not packed earth, not rubble, but a deliberate cavity about the size of a hat box, lined on its sides and bottom with pieces of flat slate fitted together with a precision that was unmistakably intentional. The bottom was covered with a doubled piece of oilcloth, folded and pressed down with the care of someone who had thought about this for a while before doing it. Cora sat back and looked at it. The light was low in the millstone room. Late afternoon, the amber panes throwing their moving patterns across the floor, and the cavity was in shadow, and she could see the shape of the oilcloth but nothing more. She carried it to the window. Inside the oilcloth were three things. The first was a small leather wallet, the kind used for documents, tied shut with a piece of braided cord. The second was a tin container about the size of a tobacco tin, sealed around the lid with a bead of old candle wax. The third was a letter, folded into thirds and sealed with wax, the seal unbroken. She opened the leather wallet first. Inside were banknotes. Not coin but paper, old greenbacks, the currency of the war years, which had been worth less than their face value for a long time, but which Ohio banks still honored. She counted them twice, and then a third time. $160, which was more money than Cora had ever held at once. More than she had earned in 4 years of hotel kitchen work. More than Vera Fisk kept in the household account at any given time. She set the bills on the windowsill and opened the tin. Inside, resting on a piece of folded cotton, was a glass inlay, a small oval of deep blue glass, faceted at the edges, set into a pewter frame with a loop for a chain. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The glass had been ground and polished by hand, and it caught the afternoon light and broke it into a small constellation of blue and white, throwing tiny points of color onto the stones around it. It was the kind of object that a person makes slowly, with great care, not for money but for love. And it was the kind of object that, once you held it, your hand did not want to put down. She held it for a long time. Then she broke the wax seal on the letter and unfolded it on the windowsill beside the banknotes. The handwriting was careful and upright. The letters formed with a schoolteacher's precision, slightly faded at the edges but clear enough. It read, "My name is Josephine Harwick, and I am writing this on the 7th of September, 1876, in the mill my father built on Garnet Creek in the year of 1851. I am 49 years old. My husband Claude died of pneumonia 2 winters ago. My son Thomas went to Kansas in the spring and has not written since July. I do not know any more whether he is well. I am writing because I have decided to go to my sister in Columbus, and I do not know if I will come back. The mill is stopping. I cannot run it alone, and I cannot afford to hire a man, and I have tried, and I am very tired. The money in the wallet is what remains of what Claude and I put aside in 22 years of milling. It was never much in any single year, but we put aside what we could after the debts were paid and the grain was settled, and it is there. The glass piece was made by my father, Harris Harwick, in the winter after he built this mill, when the creek froze and there was nothing to do but sit by the stove and work. He had learned to cut and grind decorative glass from a man in Pittsburgh, and he taught it to me, and I taught it to Claude. And Claude made this for our first Christmas in this building. I have worn it on a chain for 24 years. I am taking it off now to put it here because I cannot carry it where I am going without weeping every time I look at it. And I am tired of weeping. I would rather know it is safe than carry it and be sorry. To whoever finds this, I do not know who you are or when you will come or what brought you here. But you have come and the mill is yours, and so is what is beneath this stone. Take it. Take all of it. Use what you need to put the roof back and free the stones and set the wheel turning again. That is the only thing I ask. That someone run this mill again. That grain comes in through that door and flour goes out. My father built it to last 100 years, and I believe him. I think it has good years left in it if someone is willing to look. I hope you will find what you need here. I hope the creek is kind to you in spring. I hope the stones turn true. Josephine Harwick, written in her own hand in the mill her father built, in the early dark of a September evening with the creek running low. Cora read it twice. Then she set it on the windowsill and pressed her hands flat against the cold stone of the sill and stood very still for a long time. She did not cry the way people cry in stories. She cried the way people cry when something they did not know they had been carrying finally gets set down somewhere they can leave it. Quietly. Without drama. With a relief so large it didn't feel like emotion at all, but more like weather. She did not spend the money in a rush. She understood, with the instinct of someone who had never had enough of anything, that money was not most valuable in the moment of having it, but in the months of careful use that followed. She went to Orson Webb's store the next morning and bought flour and salt and a pound of coffee and 2 boxes of glazier's points and a roll of new bedding putty and a coil of good hemp rope, and she paid with a banknote and received her change without the feeling she'd had all her adult life when paying for anything. The slight constriction in the chest, the arithmetic running automatically in the back of her mind, the question of what the purchase would cost her later. She told Orson Webb about the mill. Not about the money, not about the letter, but about the wheel and the race and the gears. And he listened with his hands folded, and then said there was a millwright named August Dowd, about 4 miles up the county road, who had worked on half the mills in Perry County before the bad years, and who still did what his knees allowed. August Dowd was 68, with a gray beard and hands that moved with the deliberate slowness of a man who had learned that patience and force were not the same thing, and that most problems yielded to the first and resisted the second. He came on a Tuesday, walked through the mill in silence for 40 minutes, examined the water wheel, cleared a section of the mill race with a stick to check the channel depth, and came inside and said, "Wheels sound. Race needs 3 days of clearing. Gears need oil and 2 new teeth on the wallower. After that, I'd want to see the stones turn empty before I put grain to them." She said she would help with the clearing. He looked at her with an expression she recognized. She had seen it on Orson Webb's face and on Gus Mary's, the land agent. Something between reserve and reassessment. And then he nodded once and said, "We start tomorrow." They started tomorrow. A woman named Prudy Gale appeared on the 4th day with a pot of soup and a skillet of cornbread. Prudy was 55 and had the efficient warmth of someone who had long ago decided that taking care of people was the most practical thing she could do with her time. She said her family had brought grain to the Harwick mill for 30 years before it closed, and that it was about time someone got it running again. And she did not wait for thanks. She came back the following week with her husband Ned, who was a cooper, and who looked at the collection of broken and rotting barrels in the smokehouse, and said he could make her 4 new ones by the end of the month if she wanted, and that it was no trouble, which was a lie delivered with such genuine goodwill that Cora accepted it without argument. A man named Solomon Tibb, who farmed the bottomland across the creek, brought over a length of iron chain he said had been sitting in his barn doing nothing, and helped August Dowd hang it across the mill race to stop debris from clogging the wheel. He stayed for 2 hours and refused to be paid in money but accepted coffee and asked if it was true she'd reglazed the windows herself. When she said she had, he said his springhouse window had been broken since October and asked what she would charge. She told him. He said that was fair and brought her a dozen eggs as a deposit. These were not dramatic gestures. Nobody arrived with declarations or organized relief. They came the way the Valley's community had always worked. Practically, specifically, one practical act at a time, each one a quiet sentence in a conversation that had been going on between neighbors for longer than any of them had been alive. The mill race was clear by the end of the first week. The new gear teeth August Dowd carved from a piece of hornbeam he brought from his own woodpile were fitted and set by the end of the second. On a Wednesday morning in late April, with Orson Webb and Prudy Gale and Solomon Tibb standing in the mill doorway and August Dowd at the sluice gate, Cora watched the water wheel engage for the first time in 16 years. It did not turn smoothly at first. It groaned and shuddered, and the gears shrieked with the protest of machinery that has been still too long, asked to move again. August added oil, and they waited, and then the wheel found its rhythm, slow, and then steady, and then sure, and the millstones began to turn, empty, the upper runner on the lower bedstone, around and around, the sound of them a deep smooth rumble that she felt in her chest as much as heard with her ears. Orson Webb said something she did not catch over the sound of it. She turned to ask him what he'd said, and she saw that Prudy Gale had her hand over her mouth and was not unhappy. The glazing work came slowly, and then quickly. Solomon Tibb's springhouse window was first. Then the church on the main road, 3 windows and a transom which the pastor paid for in cash and gratitude. Then the county schoolhouse, 4 broken sashes, which the school board paid for in cash and considerable delays, in the way of school boards everywhere. She charged fair rates and did exact work, and the word passed through the valley the way word passes in small places, without announcement, between people who trusted each other's observations. She set up her glazing tools in the old smokehouse, which Ned Gale had helped her shore up and roof with new cedar shakes. She kept her lead cane and her scoring wheel, and her putty knives on a plank shelf, and her stock of glass on wooden racks she built from mill lumber. She stacked glass the way Ruth Pell had taught her, by type and thickness, each piece separated by strips of old newspaper, organized so she could find what she needed without searching. The shop was small and smelled of linseed oil and putty and the faint sawdust smell of new cedar. And she spent her mornings there and her afternoons in helping August Dowd learn the mill's particular habits, the quirks of its water flow, the way the east runner ran slightly faster than the west and needed adjusting each time the creek rose. She planted a garden in May, in the rich creek-bottom soil behind the miller's cottage. Beans and squash and tomatoes and a row of kitchen herbs along the south wall where they'd get the most sun. She watered it from the creek with buckets in the dry weeks and watched it grow with the careful attention of someone who has learned that gardens, like most things worth having, respond better to steady attention than to urgency. By July, Garnet Creek farmers were bringing grain to the Harwick Mill again. Not in the volumes of the old years, not yet, but in steady, reliable amounts. Corn and wheat and rye, brought in wagons and measured out in bushels, and the flour and meal that came out went home in Ned Gale's barrels or in the farmer's own sacks. She took her toll in the old way, a share of what she ground, and she stacked the grain in the clean dry loft and felt, for the first time in her adult life, the particular solidity of knowing she would eat through winter without calculating whether she could afford to. Josephine Harwick's glass piece hung on a cord above the cottage door, where the morning light came through it and made its small blue and white constellation on the whitewashed wall inside. Cora had not put it on a chain to wear. It felt more right there, more like what it was, which was not a piece of jewelry but a piece of someone's care, made solid. Beside it on the doorframe, she had hung her glazier's knife in its chamois wrapping, and Ruth Pell's notebook of measurements and glass recipes that she had kept for 2 years. And these three things, the glass piece, the knife, the notebook, sat together above the door to her cottage like a kind of inheritance she had assembled herself, from the people who had given her what she needed, not because they had, but because they had seen her clearly enough to know what she was made of. On an evening in late September, a year to the month from when Vera Fisk had set that envelope on the kitchen table, Cora sat on the mill's loading dock in the last of the day's light, listening to the water wheel turn. The sound of it was steady and low, and entirely regular, like a pulse. The creek caught the evening light and threw it in pieces across the mill pond. The smell in the air was cut grain and creek water and the first cold note of approaching autumn. She thought about Josephine Harwick, who had stood in this same place and decided she was too tired to go on, and who had been brave enough in her exhaustion to imagine that someone else might not be, who had buried money beneath a stone not as a hiding place, but as a handoff, passing something forward to a person she would never know, asking only that the person keep the work alive. She thought about Ruth Pell, who had given a young girl a glazier's knife and taught her to see what was not immediately visible. The grain of glass, the quality of light, the difference between a crack that would hold and a crack that would spread. She thought about her father, Hugh Dunne, still on the back porch in Millhaven, still waiting. She found she could think about him with something softer than anger, which was not the same as forgiveness, but might be the path to it. She did not think about Vera Fisk at all. Vera had handed her $5 as the settled sum of everything, and Cora had taken 3 of those dollars and bought a mill and a life with them. The arithmetic had been corrected. There was nothing more to calculate. The wheel turned. The creek ran. Somewhere in the orchard behind the mill, there were 3 apple trees she'd found in the undergrowth and pruned back to life over the summer. A bird called once, and then was quiet. We know what you might be thinking, that a story like this is rare, that most of the time, when someone is handed $5 and told to manage, they don't find a letter beneath a stone or gold beneath a floor. And you're right that those things don't happen every day. But here is what we believe does happen, and more often than people say. Sometimes the thing handed to you as a dismissal is the only thing you ever really needed. Sometimes the cost of a life that is yours is exactly what you have in your pocket at the moment you decide to go find it. Cora Dunne was 22 years old when Vera Fisk handed her an envelope and considered the matter settled. She had no home, no family she could return to, no plan past the edge of town. She spent $3 of the 5 on a broken-down mill in a county she'd never heard of, and she found a letter from him who had already incited a letter from a woman who was not imagining her. That is not a coincidence. That is what it looks like when two people's lives reach toward each other across the years. One of them putting something down. One of them coming along at exactly the right moment to pick it up. What was it you were handed to dismiss you, and what did you make of it instead? Tell us. We'd genuinely like to know.